Thanks. My name is Armen Avanessian. Thanks a lot to all of you coming here, being here today for this event, which is part of the Young Curators Workshop that's happening for the 6th time. It's a cooperation between the Allianz Cultural Foundation, BMW Group, the IFA, Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen, and the Berlin Biennale, the 9th Berlin Biennale. And the participation of the one French curator, this I have to read because I don't want to make a mistake, is made possible in conjunction with the program Jeune Commissaire of the Bureau des Arts Plastiques of the Institut Français, Germany. Along with the 10 days of really intense, as I already mentioned, discussions, workshops and exhibition visits, visiting artists and so on, we also decided to have 3 public events. Each of the 3 temporalities, past, present and future, will be analyzed in regard to their changed conditions and questioning the possible social role and function of art or contemporary art or post-contemporary art. So on Sunday, in 2 days, time will be dedicated to the future institutions, an event in the ADK with Chris Kreuthausen and Chris Durkin. On September 16, we'll have an event with former participants, former young curators, like Bassam El Baroni, but also former curators of this workshop or workshop series, like Johanna Varsa, who's also here today, and of course with Gabi Horn, who invented this format or this idea. And I thought that could be interesting not just for the 13 participants of this year, like to compare or discuss with former participants, but also to a general public, really discussing a bit what is the goal of such a young curators workshop, if it's more than just producing even more like young emerging curators to be thrown into this neoliberal art bubble, I heard that I'm a bit polemical, so might as well be so, like to use the contemporary art jargon, to do more than creating a paraphrase now, contemporary art jargon, reflexive temporal space for reflexive criticality or so, you know, which is just a euphemism for networking, right? So, but before we going to have these other events on the future and past, today we'll discuss the present, or rather the impossibilities or difficulties of understanding or even living in a something like a contemporaneity, having a kind of joint present, or something like Suhail, Malik and me tried to name a new time complex of the post-contemporary. Which brings, and that's something we'll definitely talk about, which brings with itself the necessity of operationalizing the present from outside itself. So that's one of the key claims, that we live in something like complex societies where our like human experience, which is related to the present, is no longer hegemonic or no longer dominant. And the question is like, so how do we orientate ourselves and how can we operationalize the present from outside? Now I come to everyone here. I mean, when I was asked to be responsible for this 10 days, really the first thing literally I did was trying to get in touch with my 3 friends and colleagues to make sure that they will be free around these days. So I'm really happy that they initially agreed and then had no way to sneak out anymore, because I put them under lots of pressure. So I will not give you a long introduction because they published a lot of like text articles, curated numerous shows. I'll just say some very brief words about, consistency is question. So first, next to me is Victoria Ivanova. She used to work at Tate, and in the human rights sphere, she co-founded, and in the, this disjunctive, and yeah. Okay. Even more disjunctive, she co-founded a cultural organization in East Ukraine. Maybe that's okay. Could be a binder. And currently, she's doing a PhD at Goldsmiths in London. That's definitely a binder. And she also contributed for this volume that Suhail and me edited for for this magazine and Merve Verlag on the time complex post-contemporary, for which she was also managing editor. What I specifically like about her work, what I really learned from her, is a shift of focus away from the social, cultural, and political claims of artworks, away from that towards their actual economic and infrastructural realities. And her claim is, if I understood correctly, that this is very often not done, and that is also what inhibits contemporary art from moving beyond critical reflection and representation, and instead what should be done, namely move towards a more constructive participation in the real. The next one is Suhail Malik. He's a senior lecturer at Goldsmiths and a co-director, a reader, and co-director of the MFA there, right? He was for 2 years at Bard. You were not a professor there, or like for 3 years? A reader or not a reader?
Fact-checking.
Yeah, fact-checking. Yeah, I had no time to fact-check. Well, I'm not sure whether it's a good thing, but most of the things I learned about contemporary art, or most of my opinions, are like his fault, right? There's some nasty things that contemporary art is just a perfect legitimizing vector for the ruling elites today, these kind of things. That might sound like one of the good old resentment that we know that against commercial art and these kind of things that we heard from many critics in the last decades, but I think what I'm interested in is that Malik's point is a different one, or goes further, namely that commercial or contemporary art doesn't just serve as a lapdog of the rich, and so by extension neoliberalism, out of critical laziness or out of ineptitude or servility. No, it's on the contrary, it is exactly these critical claims of contemporary art, however counter-commercial such art pretends to be, that suits the ethos of today's elites very well. So I think today you said that contemporary art is a decadent, self-serving mechanism, and there's a need for alternative or an exit. And since a long time I'm waiting for a book that's supposed to come out soon. Today I heard it's going to be 3 volumes. So I just want one. Just give me one. Which brings me to Tirdad Zolghadr, who actually just brought out a book. There's a book launch tomorrow, right? He's a curator and writer, or better, he's a very prolific curator and writer, so I cannot name, like, I won't even start naming all the exhibitions, biennials he worked for. But I'm sure most of you know it. If not, you will soon hear much more about him, because he is now, you already started, associate curator here at the Kunstwerke, the Institute for Contemporary Art. It's not yet post-contemporary art, but still like a top address. I insist on quoting, like, I really like the book, but there's one quote that I find very fascinating, so you have to endure that. This is not me now, as you'll realize towards the end of the quote. Today I'm increasingly bored to tears by contemporary art, but still I have more faith in its potential than anyone I know. That's also one of the reasons why I invited Tirdad, because both for his intellectual and I don't know, ethical or moral kind of like sharpness or rigor or so, but then I guess he's a much nicer and diplomatic person than me. He's like still like very hopeful and positive. So what? Capable of tears. Yeah, maybe that's also the one of the reasons. So, but instead of getting already like into a discussion, what we plan to do is have a kind of 30-40 minute like discussion here with Kathleen Ditzig, doing a kind of spontaneous response. She's an independent curator in Singapore and expert on offshore art. I did not do the fact checking. It's offshoreart.co. Yeah. Fact-checking, and has a background in cultural policy, right? So I thought we could start with one topic or one concept or one phenomenon that you all like thought about and worked about, but like it shows a bit the common ground, but also different perspectives, and that's the topic of indeterminacy. Maybe I start with you, Tirdad. For you, contemporary art is defined by a moral economy of indeterminacy, that allows curators or artists, but I assume also like writers or critics, to imagine themselves kind of as the opposite, on the other side of power. And if I understood you correctly, your claim is that it's exactly this imagining oneself at the other side of power, that this naive self-positioning that leaves it, and here I quote, politically bankrupt, intellectually stagnant, and aesthetically predictable. So maybe you can elaborate a bit on this, your ideas on indeterminacy.
Absolutely. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation, Armen, and thank you everybody for being here. I'll try to take it 2 steps back and in an effort to summarize in 5 to 10 minutes what my approach to this term of indeterminacy would be. I think there's a number of things that the speakers on this panel have in common, 2 of which are, first of all, the idea that contemporary art can be summarized as what I would call a moral economy, or that it is definable along a pre-existing set of parameters that are replicable and identifiable. And secondly, that among these parameters, one of the most potent or decisive ones is that of indeterminacy. What would I mean by that term? It's basically, it's very simple. It's not only the idea that contemporary art is open to interpretation, but that its political potential lies in this openness. So what is distinctive about contemporary art is the idea that not only can everyone come up with their own hermeneutic lines along which they can complete the work, but the very, the traction, the political purchase of art lies in this dialogical miracle that is the encounter with the audience. It is in this open moment that we can undermine stereotypes, we can subvert categories such as history and fact and memory and the institution. It is in this moment that we can redistribute the sensible, and so on and so forth. In this moment of presumed openness and generosity towards the spectator is interpolated. And the spectator is brought to feel a certain way, and I'm using the word feel consciously, because what is sparked is the idea that what is happening is unique. And the spectator feels unique in the sense that he or she feels creative and critical and perhaps reflexive. Usually also cosmopolitan. And also, this is where I go a step further and say that the spectator is taught to feel like he or she is on the other side of power. In different ways. 2 ways is, the more simple way is that very often in contemporary art there's a cause, there's a kind of identification with the subaltern, with a given victim of the powers that be, that the audience is then invited to, empathize with, and so the disidentification with power happens on this, rather simple, superficial level. But the more intricate and complicated, and perhaps the more, let's just say the more complicated and intricate moment is in the macro ideological sphere. It's this idea that this openness and this subversion of all categories is something which is inherently politically progressive, inherently transformative, inherently a best-case scenario. And it is this level which I think is hardest to grasp and understand and critique and reformulate in new directions. Why is this? Why am I being so bitter and tense about this. Maybe I should just spell that out, because I think a lot of what I've said, many of us would agree with. But I think it's in the reasons for the dissatisfaction and in the implications that suddenly differences in opinion arise. So the reason why I think this is a problem, this promise of indeterminacy, is first of all because it's empirically false. It's not what happens in an exhibition space. An audience is created, and very aggressively so, along the lines that I described earlier, creative, critical, cosmopolitan, etc. The second problem is that I find it rather boring and folkloric. It's a very formulaic template that is being used ad nauseum. Thirdly, it makes the audience think that they are creative, when the audience is actually also rendered boring by this whole operation. Because much as contemporary art insists on the open-endedness and unpredictability of its strategies, it is actually very much a predictable, replicable subject position that is created time and again. At least this is one of my hypotheses that I'm very willing to stick my neck out for later in the Q&A. Fourth and last problem with this is, again, it fuels the idea that an agenda of intrinsic and formalized subversion is something worth fighting for, that it's something progressive, and that destabilizing an institution is some kind of adventurous moment to get very excited about. So in other words, when an artist says that he or she is more interested in questions rather than answers, or when a curator says that he or she is not an expert, or when an art educator says that you learn by unlearning, these are not moments of epistemic disobedience. These are moments comparable to when your Pilates instructor says that she is strengthening your core muscles, or when Schäuble talks about balancing the budget, or when Adele talks about her ex-boyfriends. These are technocratic moments. These are moments of rehearsed moments of professional expertise that are biopolitically very productive and that are aiming towards a very precise goal. The difference being that Adele and Schäuble and my Pilates instructor know what they're doing and why, whereas artists and curators, we tend to assume that we're engaging in some kind of epistemic guerrilla operation, which is somewhat missing the point. So I'll end with the parameters along which I have been trying to rethink, reformulate the problem along new lines. And this is where I know that certain differences with my esteemed colleagues will show up. But first of all, it's the act of a form of defining the object, or rather just turning contemporary art into an object of knowledge. Like, that's one thing which I'm very invested in and which I think has in and of itself an important degree of traction. Secondly, rehabilitating terms that within the existing moral economy do not really have a raison d'être. Terms such as didacticism, terms such as agenda, ideology, but then also terms such as location, and particularly location, which is quite important to my curatorial practice. Again, I can feel eyeballs raised to the ceiling around me, but we can get to that. Apart from this conceptual a glossary, if you will. Thirdly, a closer look at the didactic operations that are happening already, de facto, within really existing contemporary art. So not to underestimate the power effects of contemporary art, and not to underestimate the colossal investment in creating a public and the ability to create a public, and to resist the idea of deconstructing this mechanism and the idea of minimizing power, but actually asking yourself what it might look like if you were to maximize it, but in the name of a given agenda. Lastly, and this dovetails with the previous point, and this came up a lot during the course of the workshop today, is an investment in structures that are both collective and future-oriented. Structures that allow the individual to withstand the gravitational pull of business as usual, and that would allow us to take seriously this extraordinary, competence in terms of statecraft, to actually not to reject or minimize, but to embrace the fact that contemporary art has become a training ground for institutional operations, that if you continue to disidentify with power, you will not be able to historicize or theorize very accurately. I'm sure that I've bored half the audience and baffled the other, but I'll end here, and that's a great place to be. And I think I'll.
Thanks, Tirdad.
Thank you. Yeah, Tirdad's preempted 80% of my presentation. So those of you who are bored will be even more bored by the time I've finished, and those of you who are baffled hopefully will be less baffled or might be more baffled. I'm going to repeat. I was thinking of how to edit as I go along, but I think that might generate more confusion. So maybe to give clarity to some of the confusions that Tirdad has generated, I'll rehearse some of the points around indeterminacy. So the indeterminacy argument is essentially made on the back of a criticism of Jacques Ranciere's argument around the politicality of what he calls art in the aesthetic regime, which exploded in sort of 2008 for about, and it's still going on, as he's the theorist of contemporary art and why contemporary art is a good thing politically. But through a kind of close argument around Ranciere's work, which I won't rehearse here, it seems to me we can draw out some general lessons which can be captured by the term indeterminacy, and Tirdad has already mentioned many of them. So we can say contemporary art claims to be political because it doesn't prescribe anything. It doesn't tell you what to do or what to think. That's up to you. And because it's up to you, through that effort to think and act for yourself, it allows a redress for a subjective place in a world which is dominated by standardization, disempowerment, disenchantment, blah, blah, blah. You know all that stuff, right? So that's the kind of political claim and the political good that contemporary art is supposed to do. It's also indeterminate because contemporary art is heterogeneous. It's hard to say, it's impossible to say what the limit or what should and shouldn't be contemporary art, right? Heterogeneous. It's indeterminate because what we do with contemporary art is we praise singularities of the work. We don't generalize. We don't speak about contemporary art in general until this argument. So we're always interested in the specificity of the work, in the particularity, and we go from one work to another, always engaged, always turned on, maybe if you're aroused, turned on in that way, but I just meant aware and cognitive. But it's up to you, because it's all indeterminate, right? And it's also, it's a space, as Tirdad's mentioned at length, in which, because we make our own meanings, we have to interpret. So there's a kind of semantic indeterminacy in contemporary art. We're not told what to think. We make our own meanings. It doesn't deliver a definite meaning to us, and that's a strong control mechanism on the kind of art that can be made, right? Art that tells you too strongly what to think doesn't really cut it anymore, right? That's not really contemporary art. It's something else, and it's also indeterminate because it's unpredictable what will happen next as art. It's an open future, and we can think about this in the very old-fashioned word creativity. Art is creative, right? These are all good things, we think. So it seems, for all of these reasons, that contemporary art is without definition. Right? It doesn't, as I've said, it doesn't prescribe anything. And also what that means is that as we interpret, as we try and make our own meanings, as we affirm the singularity, not just of the artwork or the artist or the institution, but also of ourselves, our subjective place in engaging with it, we endorse the presentness of experience as the basis for our politics. Right? So sentience, cognitive attachment, becomes the political base. So in this way, contemporary art is understood to be a moral good, an ethical good, a political good, and an epistemological good. Right? I would call this contemporary art's critical virtue. All of this is a description of contemporary art. But to come back to a point that Tirdad made, it seems to me that this is also a definition of contemporary art. So indeterminacy defines contemporary art. And as soon as you have a definition, you limit the object. Right? So as much as contemporary art is open in terms of what it could be, it doesn't prescribe what the meanings that we make out of it. Nonetheless, it's got a definition. So it's limited. And if we have a definition of it, we understand it to be a particular kind of art, not the name for all art that's ever being made in the now, which is another sense of the contemporary. And because it's definite, it means that it's not the only kind of art. And because it's definite, it means that art can overcome the typical problems of contemporary art, which Tirdad's outlined very well. And what I mean by, well, what are these problems? What are the typical problems of contemporary art? I'll rehearse some of what Tirdad said. Firstly, the allegiance, as you know very well in Berlin and every other metropolitan center, the allegiance of contemporary art with dominant forms of power associated with a concentration of capital and power over the last 40 years. Let's call that neoliberalism. Secondly, a political ineffectivity other than supporting and endorsing neoliberalism, despite itself and despite the critical claims. And thirdly, that what contemporary art ends up being involved with is a self-regard of the art field at the cost of what the content of that artwork is. So when Tirdad was speaking about the subaltern, you know the kind of work which looks at an impoverished or exploited community somewhere, turns that into the art claim. We look at the artwork. What do we think about? We think about it as an artwork, and in terms of the meanings that we can make of it, which are different between ourselves. Well, what's happening there? What happens is that the content of the work becomes a resource that we extract for our cultural benefit, right? So contemporary art is a cultural resource extraction. That's another problem. So all of these things are in a way tied in to the validation of subjectivity by contemporary art. So it seems to me that we can't separate the insistence or the kind of endorsements of subjectivity as a site of meaning-making, political action, the rest of it. We can't detach the subjectivity movement from the problems that I've just outlined. Now, if these are understood to be problems, they don't need to be. But if they are understood to be problems, and if we do stay with art, because we don't have to, but if we do stay with art, and both of these are political judgments, to understand this as a problem, that it's worth staying with art nonetheless. And it's a political problem because the question is, how do you build a future? That's what politics is, to build a future, right, collectively. If these are understood to be political problems, then we can't do contemporary art anymore, right? Which means no more indeterminacy for art. And that also means an art that we have to start thinking about in terms of the positive program, if you want, is that we have to start thinking of an art for political reasons that does not support or validate your meaning-making. Right? And I think this is where we can start thinking about the time complex. Because the time complex is a way of articulating, and we can maybe talk about it a bit later, I don't want to take up too much time now, but the time complex is a way of articulating how complex social forms which are not personal, not subjective, organize our societies in ways that are, one, political, but not based on experience. Okay? And that seems to me a model for what art needs to do if it's to get out of the contemporary art problem.
Right, this is a very tough place to pick up from. But I think you have kind of laid out all the reasons why sort of the progressive self-perception of contemporary art is in fact a false self-perception. And the way that we kind of understand the progressive status of contemporary art is usually through the claims of the art objects, the curatorial statements, the mission statements of contemporary art institutions, but just generally through this kind of discursive / almost kind of spiritual and maybe even religious belief in the fact that the sort of pseudo-autonomy of the art field from the rest of reality is a great thing because it allows us to reflect on reality, and it kind of gives us this sort of space of indeterminacy ultimately, where we can reconfigure the existing structures, but always kind of in a symbolic and in a semantic way. And I guess, as a practitioner, what I'm interested in is sort of understanding how the self-identification of contemporary art with something that's inherently progressive is ultimately a very kind of regressive action, and what can we do about it? So the reason that I stated it's regressive is that, if you have sort of, as has been outlined by Tirdad and Suhail, if you have content claims, so the claims of art objects and curatorial statements, etc., that sort of reconfigure semantically how the reality operates. What is the relationship of these objects towards the reality, not just kind of outside of the art field, but also kind of within the art field? And I think what you can really see is sort of a detachment from the claims of the artworks from the underlying reality. And I guess this is exactly what kind of Suhail refers to when he talks about the kind of value extraction syndrome of the contemporary art regime. And I think in this way, if we think about financialization as also kind of a wider cultural phenomenon that is taking place, contemporary art is a very similar thing to financialization, insofar as it uses sort of reality as a thing that the carnal fact of life, to extract value from it semantically, reconfigure it, then sort of can transpose it into the realm of circulation of ideas, and who benefits kind of from the circulation of contemporary art's ideas. I mean, the most kind of straightforward way of answering is that it's sort of the networks that are actually within those circulation mechanisms. So ultimately, it's contemporary art, or kind of the people participating in it, us ultimately, are the ones who kind of benefit from the circulation of ideas. What happens to the underlying reality, right? So something else happens. So we just say, well, no, this is good for underlying reality because it offers an opportunity to imagine a different future. But then you need to kind of look at the de facto situation, and the de facto situation both within the art field, and if we kind of look at the way that basically, let's say, reality is at the moment, it's kind of bleak in terms of increasing socio-economic inequality, also in terms of just the precarity of social and economic existence. Once again, kind of the inability to understand how actually to kind of gain traction and to transform something structural about today, because we understand that the symptoms of sort of bad infrastructural arrangements are felt on a kind of day-to-day basis. Yet, at the same time, we have kind of the symbolic realm of contemporary art, which imagines all these different futures. So the question is like, how do these relate? Beyond the fact that there is circulation of value and value generation for the participants of these discourses, like how do we actually reattach the discourses back to the underlying infrastructures, whether it is in our field or kind of outside of our field, which is also something that we need to consider. And I guess sort of for me, what's really kind of interesting as a practitioner is to think how can the kind of content claims, so the stuff that we do that we think is inherently tied to the discursive realm, kind of fold the structural and infrastructural back in. And I have a proposition which is a speculative proposition, and it's just sort of to think of practice within our field as a form of prototyping. And the reason I choose the notion of prototyping is, I mean, it stems from the design field, but what's interesting about the prototype is that it addresses itself not just towards some sort of semantic ideals or some sort of conceptual aims, but it tries to attach the conceptual aims to the existing infrastructures, but also to infrastructures as we would like to see them corresponding to those ideals. And ultimately, it becomes then an exercise, I would say, that's really relevant to our present moment, in the sense where we have two realms of, we have the circulation of that's associated with financialization, and we have what I would call the carnal realities of the everyday, which is the field from which extraction is, which are the resources for the extractive mechanisms. So through this sort of strategy of prototyping, and I think the contemporary art field is a good place to do prototyping from, for a lot of the reasons that have been here spoken about as potentially negative, but I think they could also be positive. And I think maybe one of the things that I connect back to Tirdad's presentation is, how can contemporary art become an object of knowledge, but not just knowledge as in empiric, sort of epistemological, detached dimension, but knowledge that has impact on infrastructures, and that actually folds the infrastructures back into its strategies of operation. I think that's it for now.
Yeah, maybe I made jokes before that we all have a tendency of talking too long, so the 30 minutes I announced are already over, but so I try to maybe ask one more question before we have a short response and then open the floor. But taking up a bit where you ended on this future prototyping or so. So it's a twofold question. One is about the future, and the other to take up Tirdad's book title, Traction. I mean, the future, you all talked about future. Suhail in the sense of a necessity of getting beyond the present bound like contemporary art. In Tirdad's, but as far as I know his work, there's today you spoke about future-orientated structures, but I know you're interested in more sustainable structures within contemporary art. So what about this dimension of the future? That's my first question. What is the problem of contemporary art beyond what it sees itself as its problem, namely criticizing the present or so? And does contemporary art have something like a future binding power, so to say? And related to that is the second question, really about this term of traction. What it would mean to gain traction. There's been one conceptual double that came up of content and infrastructure, or I think you, Victoria, you spoke about content and the underlying infrastructure. So I would be interested in where would you see the potential of a future binding or of a more sustainable structures, on the level of content or on the level of the infrastructures, or is that a false opposition? Or that would be a bit my question. I don't know who's crazy enough to start answering. You should.
Should I start with the future stuff? Yeah, I think it's sort of a problem also that's inherent to the term contemporary art is in the contemporary part, right? So if contemporary presumes this forever now, or now that has already taken over the past by reconfiguring it semantically, but also produced potential futures, it means that we have sort of a soft colonization of the future. So I don't think it's equally as strong as it is in the financial field, because the financial field has a much more direct impact on economic infrastructure organization. I mean, ultimately, contemporary art is still, it's more of a tangential force, but nonetheless, it does sort of delimit imagination in the sense that we're always kind of functioning from a reactionary position of like how are we reacting to the status quo, which is ultimately kind of I think a losing position in circumstances where actually kind of operating from the future, and this is the stuff where maybe both Suhail and Armen collaborate on what is meant by the post-contemporary, is sort of the kind of privileged form of producing systemic agency. So going back to the prototype, I mean, I think what's super interesting about the prototype is that it operates from a speculative future position. So you identify kind of a problem or a thing in the future that you want to address, and you kind of produce a certain model, or you sort of from that potential point. But there's a precision to that point, so I think this is where we get out of the indeterminacy problem, and there's also kind of a slightly different understanding of what, let's say, practice means in contemporary art, because it ultimately becomes not just about kind of philosophical, sort of pseudo-philosophical, ultimately, ways of engaging with the world, but it's about engaging with the kind of semantic products of that pseudo-philosophy and the realities that we operate in.
You ended your question by, Armen, by wondering whether content and structure are a false binary. I don't think they are. I mean, even though they're deeply related, very much as a chicken and an egg, and it would be hard to understand which is which at some points, or which comes first, better said. They're not quite the same thing. The question of structures is intrinsically linked to the idea of the possibility of envisioning a future, because the alternative would be to rely on individual best intentions. I mean, I know from my own practice, but also from that of pretty much all the colleagues I know, that one project after the other is embarked upon with the best of intentions, and that everybody would like to leave a mark as someone who has been transformative within the field. This is actually something we have in common. And lo and behold, it hardly ever happens, and this is because what I earlier called the gravitational pull of business as usual is just so overwhelming and so tempting to succumb to, because it also brings rewards, that without the instruments that allow you to withstand that momentum, this is all just friendly chat. It won't have any more traction than that. As for content, Victoria earlier was also pushing me to try to be a little more specific in terms of my investment in that term. And what I would suggest is that content is the moment that allows you to offer something beyond the formalism of Rancière, for example, beyond redistributing the sensible. It's allowing the possibility to disagree, which is surprisingly hard within the field, given the moral economy of indeterminacy. And this is something that is, interestingly enough, content in this sense, in the sense of a transparent agenda or a hypothetical stake, doesn't necessarily materialize in contexts where people have the best intentions. Sometimes it's just a commercial gallery sticking its neck out for an individual artist in a solo show. Like there's a particular investment that brings a certain gamble, a certain wager, a vulnerability, that can fail. This is, on some levels within the conversation that we're having, more interesting than the thematic group show, which purports to offer a hypothesis, but actually refers back to the artworks, which then refer back to the hypothesis. And so you're within this comfortable state of suspension where no possibility of disagreement is really offered. When it comes to the future, the content in question that we're looking at specifically is something that it's the hardest topic to broach, because I think that's where our ideological differences would come to the fore with a vengeance. And maybe it's not necessary to have that overarching conversation here and now. But it's kind of, to me, it's the, how do you say, the elephant in the room?
No, let's have it. Let's have the conversation. You want me to rehash the post-content?
No, but why the future? Because it's not.
Yeah. Let me just do the content infrastructure thing. I'll do it very, very quickly. With the art field, for all of the, again, this is simply to do with its politics. And if you don't care about politics, this is not an issue. So I'm assuming you do. So in the art field, when we talk about art, our interest in art, insofar as it's presented to the public, the politics is attached to the content, right? So you go around the show, any show whatsoever, you look at the work, you try and understand what it means, and then the politics is to do with the content of the work in relationship to your meaning making. So two things are involved in politics. The thing that's presented to you, which can be a formalism, it doesn't have to be people in Vietnam or whatever. It's the show that I saw recently. And also your own meaning making against the standardization of meaning, which is supposed to be taking place in what used to be called the spectacle. What's not revealed to you is the real politics of the art field, which is in the infrastructure that got that work to you in the first place, right? So if we want to think about art politically, the content of the work has to be the infrastructure by which the work is presented to you. That's the power play. And we know what that power play is. It's the collusion between the public infrastructures, such as spaces like this, quasi-public, the private gallerists, the schmoozing, the dinner party, blah, blah, blah. These are decisions that are made about who gets in what show, which is partly to do with content, but that seems to me not the real politics of the art field. So the political claim, the evident or the ostensible, declared political ambition of work is a way of disguising the infrastructural thing, which is actually going on with your meaning making there and then in front of the practice. So for me, the infrastructures have to be part of the content if we're going to seriously politicize the work, right? And so the question is, what are the economies here? Who gains? Cui bono? To go to the future issue, it seems to me the future is a prerequisite for understanding how to think to think what politics is in a larger sense. And the reason is because in what we in the post-contemporary book call complex societies, although I think it's important to stress large-scale, complex, integrated societies, global societies, these are already time machines. Right? We live in time machines now. And they're time machines because, as with the derivatives, or as with insurance, or as with big data, and sort of all the massive computation that's going on now, what the prediction or the probability of what we will do next is the precondition for what's presented to us now as an insurance premium, for example. Right? The profits that a corporation are going to make are decided in advance, and the price is set on that basis, and that's the price we pay. So the future moment, the income that the company expects to receive, determines the price that we pay in the present. So the future, I mean, these are economic models, but I think it's generalizable. So the future is the precondition of the present. So we need to understand the political field on the basis of the future. And this is important politically because, as I said, politics is the building of the future, right? The problem is, if contemporary art is premised on the presentism of experience and meaning-making, it can never do it. It can never be political in an adequate way to the societies we're in now. So what we do when we're being political in contemporary art is we're being anachronistic. We're history, right? The way to get out of this, or the way to start thinking about the politics of now, which is different to the contemporaneity of art, is just to do another art than contemporary art. And that's the call for an exit.
Kathleen, that's easy now, right?
Yeah.
Just wrap it up.
Actually, can I ask a question? Well, I'll wrap up for everyone first, but I think what I will wrap up is actually where you guys begin to propose solutions or ways. So Tirdad, you started with the parameters of turning back to the object into knowledge, rehabilitating terms of moral economy, and then you closer looking at didactic operations, but also what was interesting is that you put an investment back in the structure of the collective, that sort of within the collective that the individual could withstand the business pull, or statecraft could be embraced and so forth. But the funny thing is that when we get to Suhail actually talks about admitting that there's a problem, and then if we choose to stay with it, then we have to build a future in which we have to move the politics of art outside of the personal, so it's not subjective, not personal. And then we get to Victoria, who really talks about bringing the symbolic imaginary of art together with transforming the structural part of art through the prototyping. Now, obviously, each of you actually put hope or stress on very, very different aspects. One, for Tirdad, what really fascinates me is your sort of faith in the moment of the collective, because I actually want to hear more about what that would mean and what that can actually mean. For Suhail, the scale of which you're actually talking about, if we all have a shared project by which, I would assume with what you were saying last, if contemporary art is working towards a future, what is that shared future that we all can talk about? I mean, we move from the collective to what I would think, if we want to be talking on a shared platform or a shared ground, you may even be talking about national, international type of futures, larger projects that are, and I'm wondering what the scale is that you're talking about, or where you put the hope for that redemptive moment. If we do exit art, what that scale would be. Is it international, state, whatever? It sounds like you're moving to a redemption there. For me, I feel like you still have hope in the project. If not, you would not hold out.
I'm insulted.
Really?
Insulted.
Okay, well, if it's not redemptive, because you're calling for an exit, we leave it completely, then what is the scale you're talking about?
Because the issue isn't redemption. The issue is how to construct a politics in the art field from art, right? Maybe that's redemptive because it's kind of, well, we should still be doing politics at some level. But I don't see politics as necessarily having good solutions. I don't think we need to assume that politics is the prerogative of the left or the soft left, which kind of anarcho left, which covers our base. There's obviously a politics of the right, which is extremely successful. It seems to me perfectly feasible for them to take on art, or to not take it on as to defeat it, but to deploy art. And it's already happening. Right? It's called gentrification. And contemporary art is the key player in that process. Not that important, but important enough. So I think in terms of scale, in a way, it's for me, the argument is more about capacities. It's at this point in time, in terms of the argument that I think used to need to have to be taken place when this kind of exit thesis started, but now seems to be increasingly common sense. So there's no need to buy the book when it comes out, because it's up to the actors who wish to act and build the future what scale they want to work at. So in a way, the aim of the actors has to determine the kind of practice it is. But as soon as you have aims determining types of practices, you're out of an indeterminacy thing, because you have to be prescriptive, right? So the scale can be variable. It could be global, the call for global justice. It could be microscopic. But the type of art it has to be different to what passes as contemporary art. But there's some kind of, for me, there's a kind of dangerous slippage in language that sometimes we talk about art and sometimes we talk about contemporary art. And I think it's really important to be clear that contemporary art is not all art. It's not. It's a specific kind of art, for me, defined by indeterminacy. There are other arts, and we need to start constructing those. I don't think we're in a place yet to do that, because we're still in the overwhelming shadow of contemporary art. We're in the darkest hour. It's a little bit of poetry for those of you who like text.
I don't mean to be difficult, but I really don't think that's so... Sorry. I don't think that resolves the issue of when we talk about shared aims, right? Because the question of scale then becomes, how do you constitute that shared aim? If you say an agent's planning a future for the future, how many agents are you talking about? Are we talking at a community level? Are we talking at the collective level within the exhibition? You see, your thesis begins with a move away from the individual towards some sort of shared project of the future. The question is, how big does that sharing have to be?
Politics takes place at different scales, right?
I don't mean to make this a debate, but you see, if you're calling for the move away from individualization and subjectivity, and it's almost like creating a shared project for art. I'm curious, at what point does the individual sort of agent functioning by himself actually come together to form closer to what you're asking for? Because if you're saying that we should leave aside our individualization, subjective response to art, where then do we put that political moment? Unless we can articulate a shared project, then the question goes into scale, right? Sorry, am I just like, you will move on if that's okay.
Maybe I can redeem contemporary art a bit more, because I actually don't I don't have a complete. I kind of agree with Suhail, but I think where I sort of disagree is at the level of practice, because sort of as a curator, I kind of need to continue functioning within this regime, but maybe because I'm still a young idealistic curator, not to be ageist or anything, but maybe I haven't had enough failures yet. To kind of think that the gravitational pull of business as usual is sort of yes, it's a structural condition. I understand that, but I think you kind of need to sort of fashion models for action in the short term. And I think what kind of the stuff around post-contemporary is helpful because it gives an additional reference point. But I think there's also things that we can understand within the contemporary art regime that are very productive. And I think one of those things that is productive is actually the ability to produce transdisciplinary knowledge forms. But the question is why do you produce them and for what? And here for me the question is can you actually start shifting registers between the contemporary art field and fields outside of contemporary art? So can you perhaps operationalize the reattachment to the real through a reattachment to other industries? And of course this is something that contemporary art really doesn't like, because it ultimately means that the value of contemporary art is no longer completely within the control of the contemporary art regime. It means that we need to actually open up to other fields in much more infrastructural ways than is currently done. So I would argue not so much about an exit into different art, although that might lead to it, but about a different sort of practice and engagement with the fields of outside our own.
I'll try to answer in less than 90 seconds, because I feel that there's we could benefit from a change in dynamic. The collective. Why is the collective a good object? In my book, it has nothing to do with the creativity of teamwork. Teamwork can be one of the most frustrating things in the world. I think we all know that. It's more about, very briefly, the sheer efficiency of pooling of resources. Secondly, the counterintuitive pedagogical exercise that the collective can bring with it. So to offer de-individualization as something that is not only a best case scenario, but that is a given, an Ist-Zustand, something that you can learn to take for granted. And thirdly, actually, it's also in the interest of rendering transparent what is happening anyway, because our modus operandi more often than not is the result of quite complex collaborative operations, which are not necessarily visualized as such, but which are deeply contingent upon a brutal division of labor along many lines. That's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, maybe that's a good time to open the floor, as it's called. We have cordless Wi-Fi, whatever, microphone, and if there, oh, we got two. So if there are any questions, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for an interesting conversation. I have two questions, actually. The first is for Tirdad. I was wondering if you could say more about the moral economy of indeterminacy as you see it. I have the feeling that when I see indeterminacy mobilized in contemporary art, it's oftentimes as a way beyond moralizing. So I'd be interested to hear about how you see the moral economy of indeterminacy. And my second question is for Suhail. I would be curious to hear from you more in detail why you're skeptical about this political potential of contemporary art that you identified, which is located when essentially the content is the politics of the art, if I understood correctly what you're saying. Yeah, you were saying that you see essentially two political potentials of contemporary art. And one is where you were describing that the content itself, through its selection, essentially simply because of its selection, in that way, contemporary art is political. And you seem skeptical about that, unless I misunderstood. So I would be interested to know why you're skeptical about that as a political potential.
A quick, brief answer to the issue of the moral economy of indeterminacy. I owe the term of the moral economy to the sociologist Didier Fassin. By the way, I should also acknowledge that I owe a lot of terms and working premises here to this gentleman on my left. Suhail is very much to blame for many of the ideas that have been permeating my work for the last few years, and I should just kind of like embarrass him by putting that on the table. Embarrass myself, discredit myself. Back to Fassin's idea of a moral economy is comparable to the idea of a habitus, but it places much more emphasis on the idea of, or on the importance of distribution, and on the fact that certain places and people and ideas are valorized more for particular reasons than others, and that this can shift over time according to given parameters. And the reason why it applies, in my view, so well to contemporary art and the issue of indeterminacy is because, yes, you're right that indeterminacy is proposed as a way to avoid moralizing. Absolutely, that's the crux of it. Indeterminacy is offered as an antidote to being school teacherly or to being propagandistic or moralistic, what have you. It ultimately, what it imbues, however, within the spectator is what Suhail likes to call a sense of critical virtue. Namely, that through this operation of indeterminacy, the spectator can disidentify from all of those nasty power structures which lead to such things as facthood, authority, the institution with a small I, and the institution with a capital I, the institution at large. And this, of course, is actually a moral horizon. It's not an openly stated one, but it is one that is important and actually central to the whole operation, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow that, it seems to me what we're interested in contemporary art, it seems to me what replaces the moral horizon for contemporary art, because who wants a moralistic art? It's not the time for moralistic art. Would you like to go and see a moralistic art show? No, thank you. That's not what we do. What we want is an ethics. We have ethical encounters with artworks, right? So anyway, I think for me the more appropriate term for art is that it's an ethical undertaking. Around the politics of content, the issue is what is the political? What politics are we dealing with when we engage with art? I don't know how many of you are professionals in the art field and how many are civilians here. But if you're a civilian, then you go to the exhibition. You're given the work. You've given some discourse about it, which is meaningful, semantically indeterminate, maybe even a poem nowadays, because that adds to the frisson. That adds to your having to make the meaning between the text and the others, and it carries on. And that's if you think there are political claims in the work, you have to base it on the work itself. When we teach in art schools, we teach to content. What are you trying to do with the work? What are your claims? But that's symbolic capital, if you want to use Bourdieu's terms. But that's a microscopic moment of politics, especially in the societies that we have now. The majority of politics is to do with economies, right? The part of the politics of the work is the stuff that professionals know. You're looking at this piece in this biennial, I mean any biennial, because the gallerist sponsored it and made a claim, had dinner with the curators. We know this circuit. If you don't know this circuit, then you're a civilian. But we know, right? You go and see certain works in certain exhibitions, you know exactly why it's there. It's nothing to do with the practice, nothing to do with the content claims of the work. The question is, why separate that out, right? It seems to me the full political range of the practice is why it's there in terms of the institutions and infrastructures that exhibit art and produce the discourses and produce its meanings. The economy is part of the meaning of the practice, part of the meaning of art. And unless we take that into account, we're not really dealing with the politics of art. We're not. We're dealing with a conceit about what politics is. At the very same time that in general we complain about neoliberalism as an economization, right? That we need another economy than the neoliberal one. Yet we don't want to look at the economy as a condition for the political meaning of the practice. So the issue is that it's not enough to look at content to understand arts politics. Right. And just, that's fine. I can go on.
I had a question concerning the fact that the reason why we're here is the title post-contemporary, and I heard a lot about contemporary art, and then maybe there is post-contemporary art, since that is the reason why we're all here. And I was wondering in how far it might relate to BMW, Allianz, IFA, the KW and other institutions, and maybe institutions such as the so-called police, who also determine what's art and what's not art. That would increase my customer satisfaction rate.
I don't know. Whether BMW is responsible for post-contemporary art?
No, and how far, I mean, those institutions, the people who give money for, that, how are the relationships of the post-contemporary?
They gave money for the contemporary, the money was there already before for contemporary art workshop, and they didn't know about the post-contemporary. So that would be my answer. Joanna? Or you know more?
I want to ask a bit more about that question, because what worries you in this? Is this the question of the kind of the sort of
the post-contemporary a continuation of the contemporary?
What's the relationship?
Exactly, to art and to contemporary art, because
can you answer that?
The language itself, there is no distinction. The post can be taught.
And why the post? I think that's also important. Yeah.
There's a lot involved in the question. The contemporary is a name that crosses, so slides between the name of what's happening now. It's happening now. It's contemporary, and a kind of art, contemporary art, right? And I guess the commonsensical position is that contemporary art is the name of the art that's happening now. The move, if we can define contemporary art on the basis of indeterminacy, contemporary art isn't necessarily about the art that's happening now. What you see quite a lot in art history in an effort to make itself relevant to students interested in contemporary art and not in art history is to say that every artist is contemporary at the time, therefore all art was contemporary at some point or another, blah, 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 right? So you kind of, you fight off the curating courses who are stealing the students by saying we still can speak to contemporaneity even in the 1900s, even in the 1700s, and so on and so forth. So the post-contemporary as a name, I mean, I'm not happy with the phrase post-contemporary. I prefer time complex. But the post-contemporary speaks, in terms of art, it speaks for me about the exit from contemporary art, which is to say another kind of art than contemporary art. But the post-contemporary is also a way of speaking about the time complex in that... okay, this is going to take... This will be a little detour. I'll try and do it very quickly. The contemporaneity of contemporary art is partly to do with indeterminacy. Part of the indeterminacy is it doesn't really matter when things happen, right? So the kind of structuring order of time, a past, a present, and a future, gets kind of weakened by the contemporaneity of contemporary art. You can understand this very quickly because in terms of the way we deal with precedents of art being made now, the historical artwork is not something to be rejected, which was modernism. It's not something to be cited, which was postmodernism, both of which assume the distance between the present and the past. With contemporary art now, the historical precedent is kind of current with the work now. So if somebody's making minimalist sculpture, whatever now, you look at minimalist sculpture in the 60s, and it's kind of equivocal, right? One has more authority, is more museumified. The new artist or the emerging artist, the artist in the art school is kind of making work which has a different meaning, different status, and so on, but it's on an equal playing field with a historical precedent. So the kind of dissolution or the weakening of historical difference is the contemporary, right? So the contemporary is the overcoming of time sequence, essentially. So the argument around the time complex is that the future and the past and the present are demarcated. They are still established in their difference from one another, but they're not ordered in the usual way, right? So the time complex argument is that it doesn't follow the logic of contemporaneity as regards time. The issue is whether contemporary art can meet the conditions of the time of societies built on a time complex. I think they can't because they don't take time seriously enough as a destroyer of the present, as destructive of history. And in order to address or make work that's adequate to the time complex of complex societies, you need another art than contemporary. And that's the point at which the post-contemporary, the time complex stuff, meets the post-contemporary art. I can't speak to the sponsorship things, but I don't see any reason to be embarrassed or feel humiliated that BMW... The issue is kind of, to come back to the point as the response earlier, the question is, well, okay, what is the political situation about BMW in relationship to these claims? Well, they're happy with it. It's not a problem. Nothing in contemporary art presents a problem to those kinds of sponsors. If you think it's a problem, then you need to do something apart from contemporary art. You have to. Like, they don't. It's fine. It legitimizes, right? I mean, the thing is not to get into, for me, not to get into the kind of masochistic, because masochists enjoy their pain. The masochistic moment of how we suffer. Look, we can only treat this cynically, so on and so forth. That's a kind of have your cake and eat it moment. The point would be to sort of endorse and mobilize those sponsorships, or maybe prefer certain sponsorships over other sponsorships, right, in order to kind of complete the task, because that's part of the semantics of the art.
I kind of just wanted to also reiterate this point that I think that the fact about sponsorship, I think it's something that's always this sort of repressed reality about how contemporary art functions. So it's something that kind of takes it out of its Garden of Eden in terms of its self-perception. So I think on the contrary, kind of embracing the fact that contemporary art functions as it does, and actually starting to think, how do we operationalize this interest that exists from agents of gentrification, from corporate actors, from various people who need kind of transfer their financial capital into cultural capital. How do we operationalize that? And I think it's sort of, for me, it's a maturity of strategic thinking, and it's but it sort of requires the kind of realizations that Suhail was talking about. So I think kind of the step towards the post-contemporary is like, yes, this is what it is, but how do we operationalize this present, this kind of status quo, towards a different kind of future?
Johanna?
Yes, I wanted to ask all of you, but I guess most Victoria, about the human rights question, because at the beginning you made this very clear distinction that there is art and human rights that you have been involved in. And Suhail, you have been also mentioning human rights in some of your texts and comparing them to the claims of contemporary art. So is there something that in your horizon of art human rights can offer, or what would be the dynamic between them? And the second part of my question is about, you mentioned that you seek for attachment to other fields outside of art. So when I hear that, I'm thinking like of artist placement group that was placing artists on the boards for, not making art only, but also being on the boards of institutions. Is this somehow the horizon or the direction, or it's not at all?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Actually, kind of the text that I contributed to this volume actually speaks to the sort of similarities, and also to kind of, I would say, to the familial status of the contemporary art regime in its entirety. So the content claims, the infrastructures, and the human rights regime. Also the content claims, the kind of humanist project, but also the realities of its infrastructures and how it has been deployed geopolitically, since Second World War. And what interested me kind of is the systemic analysis of both of these systems to understand how, in fact, they kind of embody different visions of liberalism. So if, let's say, the human rights system embodies a vision of liberalism that's firmly rooted in legalism, in the fact that kind of a good liberal society needs to have good accountable structures of governance, which are always somehow kind of the power of which is leveraged by power of other institutions. So this idea that an individual is not just subject to the sovereignty of the nation state, but there's some other kind of exterior agent that also controls, or at least kind of can adjudicate on the nation state. And so basically kind of legalism offered, and the human rights system offered, one kind of way of ordering the global environment through this human rights vision. And apart from all the kind of dysfunctionalities of the institutional couplets of the human rights, one of the biggest problems of the human rights kind of abstractions and ideologies is this sort of transcendental human figure. And the fact that it's ultimately based, it's rendered transcendental, but it's based on a very kind of specific humanist kind of, white Western male approach to what a good life in society would mean. And hence the reason why it didn't really have any future attractions. I think this is where the post-contemporary is also quite interesting. In turn, the contemporary art regime, it offers a multiplicity of subject positions. So kind of the liberalism that's espoused by contemporary art, we've discussed this quite a lot tonight, it's the liberalism that espouses difference, the fact that we're kind of defined by our context, but simultaneously we're all kind of global cosmopolitan or just global subjects, because the differences of our context is what binds us. And this resonates for me very closely with the logic of kind of market-oriented liberalism. So I guess this is where the intersection between kind of Suhail's proposition that contemporary art is basically a system of neoliberalism, and kind of my approach to contemporary art as a system of neoliberalism, but more kind of situated within the domain of various liberal mediation regimes, as opposed to just kind of interpreting what contemporary art does from the inside. And I think the other question was in relationship to what one has to give the other, or maybe I have...
About the attachments to the other.
Okay, yeah, and I guess here, so this is where kind of the slightly more optimistic, enough with pessimism line comes in, is that I'm actually, I am quite attached to the human rights regime because I think it was able to produce systems that at least aspire to have some sort of feedback mechanism from the individual claimant, from kind of the individual level to the kind of global abstract and back. It failed for many reasons. You know, I think the failings are much more pronounced than the successes, but I think there's something to be retained about that in terms of how we want to build our structures. So I kind of see, but simultaneously see the contemporary art regime as a regime that can reflect on sort of on how the human rights regime can be modified in terms of its subject positions, in terms of how it approaches context, in terms of kind of actually the ambiguity and the indeterminacy that is necessary for the human rights regime to kind of reinvent itself and to become a sort of post-human rights regime, if you may call it. So for me, let's say kind of as a practitioner, I am actually quite interested in kind of moving between these two spheres and sort of trying to understand whether contemporary art can become invested into a kind of post-human rights ideology and how that would look in practice.
All right. We have like time for like one more short question.
Okay, I'll try to make it short, but I had a strong problem with actually grasping the idea of contemporary art, the way you sketched that between three of you. It feels for me like one point on which you agree is that the contemporary art is something that enters some sort of an intersubjective realm presently. But then I wonder what happens to different pieces that have been created before, but can undergo some reinterpretation, or works that are being made right now that will be interpreted differently in future. And then to move to my question is that, of course, I do agree that viewer when entering any kind of exhibition space is confronted with some sort of structures that are visible and also those that are invisible. But what I wonder is that I think that when we speak about political agenda, then we do necessarily have to see it differently on the level of an artwork and the level of an infrastructure that brings this artwork to the viewer. Oh, well, because this artwork can very likely, outlive that political situation in which it's presented, so can be presented in future in a different circumstances. So, and also, I can think of many artworks that do not necessarily have a strong political agenda, but then I kind of don't believe that one that is on the level of organizing or curating can really avoid taking some sort of a political responsibility for a way that the whatever content is being presented in that time point when it is.
I would. I mean, it was. The brief answer would be that the artwork that is being shown in the future is, even at that moment when it is perhaps transcending the infrastructural preconditions of today, will be subject to infrastructural preconditions of tomorrow. Like, there will never be a moment when the artwork just pops up innocently, bereft of any of the considerations that Suhail was, enumerating. So that would be my response. I think that also the first point you made, which was along similar lines about the fact that there are moments of interpretations that differ historically. I completely agree. Along the lines of what Suhail was saying earlier, we should not colonize the past along the lines of contemporary art and assume that these modes of interpretation were always valid. Like that is precisely not what we are saying here, but that these the particular play of indeterminacy is subject to a historical moment, and that if that is the case, then it can also change. That's the best I can offer.
Yeah, to go to that point, you said maybe there's other stuff being made now that doesn't sort of fit into this. We won't be able to see it unless we define the contemporaneity of contemporary art other than in terms of just stuff that's being made now, right? So if contemporary art is just like, hey, what's happening now, what's happening next week, what's happening in 2 years' time, and each is contemporary's time, then it's impossible to see work that's not acting in this way, because contemporary art is the hegemonic, dominant form of what we take art practice to be and how it should operate. It's also the case that lots of art is understood not to succeed, not commercially and so on, just succeed as artwork because it's too moralistic, it's too didactic, it's not ethical enough, it doesn't leave space for the viewer, all that kind of stuff that art schools all over the world are telling their students, right? That it seems so there's a kind of legitimacy about how that governs how art, not just for artists, also curators, people who do discourse, everyone in the art field. We should all be supporting this space for the viewer, the kind of subjective reward moment. But it seems to me that unless there's a delimitation of what we understand contemporary art to be, we can't see the other stuff and validate it in other terms, right? So for me, what works really well with the indeterminacy claim is that once the indeterminacy thing for me is not just a description. I said this earlier. It's not just a description of what contemporary art is. It's a definition of contemporary art, and therefore it's a prescription of contemporary art. Like you can say what contemporary art should be and will be because it does indeterminacy. And there's another art that doesn't do that kind of, other arts that don't do that kind of stuff. What it also means is you can go back beyond 1960-ish, when the prevalent form of contemporary art we have now kind of kicked off before it became so hegemonic, and see work in 1850 or 1640, whatever, which is kind of doing the indeterminacy thing. I don't think you'll find it very much, right? But it would be a mistake to kind of, as Tirdad just said, to sort of code everything as necessarily contemporary art to its time, which is, I think, a really destructive moment in art history right now. But the issue is really, what's the art of the future? And if contemporary art is the name for all art that's being made now, then it's the last word. There's nothing else that's going to happen, because all art that we've made now will be contemporary art. We're done. It's the end. Right? That's the post-historical moment, and that's probably the end. It's like, I gave you. Our customer satisfaction manager is happy.
There is an alternative. That's what neoliberalism says, and contemporary art. So now we heard there is an alternative. Thanks a lot to the three of you, and Kathleen, whom I have to explain that when we planned this panel, we didn't know yet that you would be here, and that's why you actually should have been the fourth person on the panel, especially instead of me. Thanks to all of you for coming, and do come again to the events on the 12th and 16th and so on. Thanks a lot, Tirdad, Victoria, Suhail, Kathleen.